All right. Hello, class. Welcome to the lecture for this week. This week we are going to be continuing, once again, our trek through the exciting timeline of Jewish history. So last week we ended talking about the fall of the Second Temple, of Herod's Temple, and the complete and utter destruction of the temple and the expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem. Last week I ended with the question of how do you continue the faith? How do you continue with a religion that is structured around holy places such as the temple, the city of Jerusalem, the land of Israel? How does that institution or organization or religion continue? And I have alluded to this and talked about how the main reason at this point that Judaism is able to continue is that Judaism adopts a practice and standard that allows it to continue to be relevant in the diaspora. Now, if you remember, we've talked about that concept of diaspora, and I talked about it briefly in my introduction to the module this week. And diaspora means the dispersion of the Jews. And that's why I entitled this The Rise of the Rabbis Through the Advent of Hasidism, Establishing a Worldwide Jewish Community. So what we see in this lecture is really going to show how Judaism sort of proliferated worldwide and how it was able to continue to survive. Because again, we've talked previously about how there have been a lot of small ethnic or religious groups that have eventually just faded out of existence because either their movement has failed or they have just kind of intermarried and dispersed throughout the world and lost their cohesion, lost their identity. But that did not happen to Jews, and that's obvious because we have, we know and understand Judaism as a distinct religion and people here in the modern day. And so the purpose of this trek through Jewish history is to understand how it began and how Jews got to where they are today. So let's launch right in. The rise of the rabbis. This is a very significant thing to understand. In fact, rabbinical Judaism is also often called formative Judaism. It is an essential piece of the Jewish puzzle in understanding how Judaism came from being a sect or a religion that focused on temple worship and on the rites of sacrifice in the temple to Judaism today where there is no temple, but Judaism is still a vibrant and alive religion all throughout the world. So one of the reasons that was possible is because of a change in the structure of leadership and worship in the Jewish community after the destruction of the temple. Now, we talked a little bit about in a couple weeks ago when we talked about Moses' receipt of the law on Mount Sinai. That is one of the most significant moments in Jewish history, and we will have pretty much a whole module devoted to the concept of covenant and election by God, and Sinai as the key representative component of that principle and concept. But needless to say, this is a very important time in history, in Jewish history, is when Moses receives the law. Now, he receives the written law. We have that in the Torah. But there's also the understanding and the tradition that Moses also received an oral law, or a law that was to be passed down, transmitted from one generation to the next orally. And the oral law, the purpose of the oral law was basically to understand and interpret the written law. So the oral law was kind of an almost like commentary or additional information about how to practice and live the written law. And according to Jews, especially rabbinic Judaism, this oral law is every bit as important as the written law. It's essential to understanding how to live the law, because Jews are constantly in changing circumstances, and where the written law may have been intended or specific to one particular kind of social circumstance, the oral law allows that law to be adapted as Jews change throughout time. So there's a really important and significant figure that we have to identify that kind of almost like kind of launched this concept of rabbinic Judaism. Now, rabbis had been kind of an important part of leadership of Judaism, but Judah Hanasi, which means the prince, Judah the prince, he was the first one that actually gathered all of the oral law and wrote it down. Now, a lot of people saw this as heresy because the idea was that the oral law had to be oral, and that was part of what made it what it was. But Judah Hanesi and others opined that without some sort of written codification or at least written copy of the oral law, that the oral traditions would eventually be lost, especially following the destruction of the temple and the dispersion of the Jews throughout the world. So he basically compiled and wrote the oral law, and that became known as the Mishnah. So if you've ever heard of the Mishnah, it is basically the oral law in written form. And that was transcribed, written down about 200 CE. Now, another key term is the Gemara. The Gemara is basically the oral law on the oral law. I know that sounds confusing, but it's basically the commentary or the discussions that rabbis had surrounding the Mishnah. So they would take the Mishnah, which is the written oral law, they would read it, they would discuss it, and there would be commentary generated. And that commentary is the Gemara. Now, most of you have probably heard of the Talmud. The Talmud is basically, it's pretty easy, it's just the Mishnah plus the Gemara. It's a compilation of the Mishnaic texts and then a writing of the discussions of the rabbis. So if you look at a tractate of the Mishnah, or excuse me, of the Talmud, it will usually have kind of a section of writing that's the Mishnaic interpretation, and then it'll have the discussion, and it'll usually have casts of characters. It'll say, this rabbi said this, and then the following rabbi responded with this, and then a lot of times it'll come up with a consensus where the rabbis discuss it together, the leaders discuss it together and come up with a consensus. Now there's two different versions of the Talmud, and that basically is because there's two different Gemaras. There's the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud, sometimes referred to as the Palestinian Talmud. Excuse me. Now, the reason that is because remember, when the Jews left Babylon, many of them didn't leave. Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, these leaders came down with a significant number of Jews, but most of the Jews stayed in Babylon and just became part of the diaspora Jewish community. So there were a lot of Jewish leaders and a rabbinic tradition that developed in Babylon, so that the Babylonian interpretation of the Gemara, of the Mishnah, led to a slightly different interpretation than the Jews in and around Israel. So we have basically a Babylonian Gemara and a Jerusalem Gemara that are combined with the Mishnah to make up two different Talmuds. Now I will say that the Babylonian Talmud is seen widely as being the authoritative or most important version of the Talmud. So if you hear talk of the Talmud, or if the Talmud's being studied in a yeshiva, which is basically a place of learning for Jews, it's most likely the Babylonian Talmud. Now all of this is important because it creates a new pattern of worship, a new pattern of structure to the community. Now the community is not centered in and around a city and a kingdom led by a king, but a community can be self-sustaining. The Jews that live in Babylon compared to Jews that are cast out and dispersed throughout the Middle East can still function because Judaism has transitioned somewhat into a literary tradition so that they can take the texts, they can study them, they can gather the leaders around, and they can basically function as an insular community. Now, this insularity is really important because, like I mentioned before, a lot of times these existing groups will and ethnic communities and stuff will just fade out of existence, and it's because they disperse throughout the population in general and lose their identity. But this idea of insular living allowed Jews to maintain this cohesion in tight-knit communities throughout the Middle East, throughout Europe, throughout the world, which allowed them to maintain their identity. It's very fascinating, and a lot of this came as a result of the rise of rabbinic authority. You see a transition in authority throughout the course that we've talked about. We had initially prophetic authority, Moses, Joshua. We had the judges, Gideon and others. Then we had the kingships, Saul, David, Solomon, and kings of Israel and Judah. And then we had the involvement of outside empires, and then a new kingship through the Hashmoneans, King Herod, a less legitimate king. And now you have a new pattern of leadership where it's focused in and around the rabbis. Now we'll see throughout the rest of this lecture that this, Judaism was more successful in certain parts of the world than others and given more autonomy to govern itself. Um, but the bottom line is that this structure of um, authority centered in and around the rabbis allowed Judaism to continue throughout time. Now, as I mentioned, it was more successful in some areas, but the bottom line is that the Jews were largely rejected throughout the world. So Jews dispersed. This is a map that shows all of the areas of expulsion and the dates in which Jews were expelled. So almost every area in Europe actually expelled the Jews at one time or another. This concept of Sephardim is important. It's a reference to the Jews of essentially in and around the Western Europe and the kind of the Spanish region, the identification of Sephardic Jews. Ashkenazi is another term that comes from the Eastern European Jews. But the reason I mention Sephardim is because there's a lot of significant and interesting history surrounding the Jews of Spain and Portugal that we'll talk about in just a moment. But you can see that the Jews were expelled from almost every area of Europe. Excuse me. Now let's talk a little bit more about that expulsion specific to Spain and Portugal. Most people know the year 1492 as the year that Columbus sailed the ocean blue, but Jews that are aware of their worldwide history know that as a much more sobering date, and that's the date that Jews were expelled from Spain, basically driven out of Spain entirely by King Isabella or Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, the same ones that commissioned Columbus, also expelled all of the Jews in 1492 from Spain. Many of the Jews went to Portugal, other parts of Europe, some went to Holland, some went to the New World. There were certain settlements in Brazil and things like that where Jews found some solace for a certain amount of time, but most of those settlements fell under the auspice and the control of the Spanish Empire, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in 1497, Portugal actually went further, and all the Jews that had not left were forcibly converted to Christianity. So taken and forcefully baptized, and they became Christians. So basically, they nullified their Jewish population entirely. Now, obviously, what this did is, forced conversion does not have a history of creating, legitimate worshipers. But really, what it does is it drives the worship underground. And you have the creation of this concept of crypto-Jew or Marrano, which is a reference to Jews, and sometimes this phrase is used for Muslims that are forcibly converted as well. But the crypto-Jew and the Marrano ends up being Jews that are forced to hide their Judaism. They're forced to practice their rituals and worship in secret, and there could be great consequences if they are caught. The term that's often used is Judaizing, or talking about their Judaism, or preaching their Judaism, or even practicing Judaism. This is very reminiscent of what we talked about last week or the week before about Daniel in Babylon, refusing to worship the gods of the Babylonians and being thrown into the lion's den. So, Jews have always sort of, when they aren't in their central kingdom in Israel during that time period, they're a minority throughout the world, forced to kind of navigate, these situations where they're surrounded by a majority that is tied to another and distinct religious tradition. So here you see this creation of this underground Jewish worship that takes place significantly in Spain and Portugal and other parts of Europe. Now, again, we're moving really quick and we're passing over a lot of stuff, but I want to talk briefly about the Jews and the Ottoman Empire. So those that are interested in worldwide history and world history are probably familiar with the Ottoman Empire. Everybody should be, because it was one of the longest lasting, largest empires in the world. right? So there were a period of time that the Greeks controlled, the Romans controlled. We're very familiar with all these big empires, but the Ottoman Empire lasted significantly longer than all of these other empires. You can see the expanse of the Ottoman Empire, northern Africa, the Middle East, Europe, and we'll see the dates here. So the Ottoman Empire went from approximately 1299 to 1923. The Ottomans essentially aligned themselves with Germany in World War I, and after the loss in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was dissolved at that point. But you can see that it lasted for almost 700 years. Now, the method of rule among the Ottoman Empire was maybe similar to the Persian Empire, in which they basically allowed their minorities to govern themselves. It was a concept that was called the millet system. It was very advantageous for Jews. Now, even though the Ottoman Empire is a Muslim rule, we cannot take our conceptions, our modern day conceptions, into our understanding of world history. So we may think, oh boy, I know based on common understanding that Jews and Muslims are kind of at loggerheads, that there's a conflict. Now, much of the conflict comes from the modern day state of Israel and development following that, and we'll talk about that throughout the semester. But you have to know that it wasn't always the case. There wasn't always that same level of animosity or antagonism or even conflict, but rather the Jews succeeded tremendously under Ottoman rule. There was great halakhic freedom, halakha meaning Jewish law, so great freedom for the Jews to operate and function under their own legal system and to continue perpetuating that legal system, which is tied into the oral law and the written law that I talked about before. We also see a significant amount of economic growth. So whereas, our conceptions might be to think, well, Muslims and Jews don't get along, so my guess is that the Jews had a really hard time living under Muslim rule. And Christians and Jews kind of share this common Judeo-Christian concept, so they probably worked well together. Well, that really wasn't the case. And the other example that I want to juxtapose this with is Christian rule under the Spanish Empire and the concept of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, these dates don't align perfectly, but you can see there's a significant amount of time that Jews were in the Ottoman Empire were succeeding, and a lot of the readings will talk about Jews, and the reading for this week will talk about Jews in the Ottoman Empire and the significant impact that they had. But then you have a very similar time period where the Spanish Inquisition was active, and many Jews were targeted in Spain, in other areas controlled by Spain, in the New World, in Brazil, and Brazil with Portugal, and there was also an Inquisition in Portugal. But an example is Luis de Carvajal. This is a really fascinating character, and I would have loved to include his autobiography in the readings, but it's just a little bit longer, and I didn't want to, make your readings too heavy for this week. But I'll just explain briefly. Luis de Carvajal was born in 1537, and he was essentially came to rediscover his Judaism and became a Marrano or a crypto Jew, basically, that was practicing Judaism in secret. There's this really fascinating narrative where he and his brother try to figure out how to perform the circumcision on themselves as adults. And, how they have to kind of stumble through trying to figure out their Judaism. In fact, there are actually accounts of Marranos taking tractates of the Talmud from Christian polemics. So this is basically Christian writings that are antagonistic towards Jews, Christian writings that are criticizing Judaism, and in those writings they're quoting parts of the Talmud in order to tear down the Talmud, but Jews are taking those same writings and pulling those pieces of the Talmud out because that's the only thing that they have. They don't have access to the Talmud, but they do have little snippets of the Talmud in these Christian writings that are negative towards Jews. So it's just fascinating the extent to which these people are going to try to understand what it is to be Jewish and to practice their Judaism and to experience that faith in their lives. Luis de Carvajal is a good example of that. He was captured by the Spanish Inquisition twice and was ultimately executed by the Spanish Inquisition for Judaizing. All right, so I want to get into the rise of Hasidism. Now, there's some context that has to be explained. In 1626, there was a leader that rose up in the Jewish community named Shabtai Tzvi. Now, Shabtai Tzvi was basically proclaimed by a religious leader of the time, Nathan of Gaza. Nathan of Gaza proclaimed Shabtai Tzvi to be the Messiah. So we see some history repeating itself. It sounds very much like Rabbi Akiva proclaiming, you know, the previous false Messiah that we talked about last week. So you see the same thing, Bar Kokhba, excuse me, the name escaped me for a moment, Bar Kokhba. Now we see the same thing happening with Shabtai Tzvi, and the idea is that he will free the Jews from Muslim rule. Now Shabtai Tzvi gained a huge following. He had a very significant following in Europe and in the Middle East, and a lot of Jews believed that he would free the Jews from outside control and restore, control and basically perform the responsibilities that Messiah was supposed to perform. And he eventually was brought before the Sultan, and the Sultan basically gave him three choices. He said, you can test your divinity, if you truly are this Messiah that you talk about, by a volley of arrows. And we'll have our archers shoot a volley of arrows at you, and if you are divine, then you'll be fine. You will live, and we'll know that what you say is true. You can be impaled, which is basically to have a stake driven up through your body from the bottom up through the top. Or you can convert to Islam. Shabtai Tzvi took the day to think about it, came back, converted to Islam. And all of his retinue converted to Islam, and he basically became an employee of the Sultan at that point. So this was absolutely devastating for the Jewish community, and it brought about a very low point in the Jewish community in terms of questioning whether or not Judaism would continue and whether or not they would be able to continue in practicing their traditions and beliefs, because this was just significantly devastating. And you see at this point some Jews just choosing not to practice Judaism anymore, to convert to Christianity, to join the communities that they are a part of, to abandon the insular Jewish communities, to expand out and do what we talked about before, which is essentially just integrate into the broader communities. So you see a real threat to Judaism at this time, and is brought along by this failure of this Messiah, this proclaimed Messiah, Shabtai Tzvi. Now, as we know, Judaism didn't cease to function at that point, and one of the reasons for that, you see that all throughout time, there's different things that come along that allow the tradition to continue and propel it forward. And one of those was this character, this ecstatic worshiping character of the Baal Shem Tov. Israel ben Eliezer, born in 1698, came at a time when the Jewish community was devastated by the failure of Shabtai Tzvi and his conversion to Islam. He created basically a form of worship that was more ecstatic, more mystical in its approach. Now, the mystical approach to religion is fascinating. Almost every major religious tradition has this mystical tradition throughout: Christianity, Islam, Judaism, certainly. And the mystical approach, think of it this way: it's basically an emphasis on a relationship and a connection with God. There's a heavy focus on prayer. There's a heavy focus on ecstatic worship, exciting worship. It's not dour. It's not, Hasidic Judaism was not the Judaism of the kind of the rabbinic community necessarily. There was still rabbinic authority. Baal Shem Tov had rabbinic authority, but it wasn't, this idea of just kind of sitting around and talking about text. It was going out and experiencing your faith in a new and exciting way. And this was so important for the Jewish community. And there was a tremendous response, and Hasidic Judaism became very important to the continued survival of Judaism, even to the point where Hasidic Judaism is still very active and very much a part of the Orthodox Jewish community today. There's significant amount of Hasidic Judaism being practiced in Israel, in the United States, all throughout the world. And it basically started with this character, the Baal Shem Tov. I recommend that this would be a fascinating paper topic to explore his character a little bit more. I would recommend doing some research on him and on the influence that he had on the Jewish community. Very, very, very important. So you can see that you know as we've gone through this lecture, we talk about this rise of rabbinic authority and the challenges that the Jews had to face with expulsion, um, and living in some cases their religion in secret without even rabbinic authority, trying to figure out what it means to be Jewish. Other Jews that are able to be successful in maintaining these insular communities throughout the Ottoman Empire. Um, and then ultimately leading to the failure of the messianic claim of Shabtai Tzvi and the rise of the Baal Shem Tov and the creation of Hasidic Judaism. So next week we'll continue the trajectory. We'll talk about the next step in the development of the Jewish people, and the next step will kind of bridge the gap between um, the this time and the modern time. We'll understand concepts that will help us understand Zionism and the rise of Israel quite a bit better and how it connects to this time period. So hopefully you have a great week. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you next week.